Ranger's Apprentice, The Ruins of Gorlan by John Flanagan. This is Book 1 in the Ranger's Apprentice series, dedicated for Michael. Prologue. Morgoth, Lord of the Mountains of Rain and Night, former Baron of Gorlan, in the Kingdom of Arlen, looked out over his bleak, rain-swept domain, and for perhaps the 1000th time, cursed. This was all that was left to him now, a jumble of rugged, granite cliffs, tumbled boulders, and icy mountains, of sheer gorges and steep, narrow passes, of gravel and rock with never a tree or sign of green to break the monotony. Even though it had been 15 years since he had been driven back into this forbidding realm that had become his prison, he could still remember the pleasant green glades and thickly forested hills of his former fief, the streams filled with fish, and the fields rich with crops and game. Gorlan had been a beautiful living place. The mountains of Rain and Night were dead and desolate. A platoon of wargulls was drilling in the castle yard below him. Morgoth watched them for a few seconds, listening to the guttural rhythmic chant that accompanied all of their movements. They were stocky, misshapen beings, with features that were halfway human, but with a long, brutish muzzle, and fangs like a bear or a large dog. Avoiding all contact with humans, wargulls had lived and bred in these remote mountains since ancient times. No one in living memory had ever set eyes upon one, but rumors and legends had persisted of a savage tribe of semi-intelligent beasts in the mountains. Morgoth, planning a revolt against the kingdom of Arlen, had left Gorlan fief to seek them out. If such creatures existed, they would give him an edge in the war that was to come. It took him months, but he eventually found them. Aside from their wordless chant, wargulls had no spoken language, relying on a primitive form of thought awareness for communication, but their minds were simple and their intellects basic. As a result, they had been totally susceptible to domination by superior intelligence and willpower. Morgoth bent them to his will, and they became the perfect army for him, ugly beyond nightmares, utterly pitiless, and bound totally to his mental orders. Now, looking at them, he remembered the brightly dressed knights in glittering armor who used to compete in tourneys at Castle Gorlan, their silk-gowned ladies cheering them on and applauding their skills, mentally comparing them to these black-furred, misshapen creatures. He cursed again. The wargulls, attuned to his thoughts, sensed his disturbance, and stirred uncomfortably, pausing in what they were doing. Angrily, he directed them back to their drill, and the chanting resumed. Morgoth moved away from the unglazed window, closer to the fire that seemed utterly incapable of dispelling the damp and chill from this gloomy castle. 15 years, he thought to himself again. 15 years since he had rebelled against the newly crowned King Duncan, a youth in his 20s. He had planned it all carefully as the old king's sickness progressed, banking on the indecision and confusion that would follow his death to split the other barons and give Morgoth his opportunity to seize the throne. Secretly, he had trained his army of wargulls, massing them up here in the mountains, ready for the moment to strike. Then, in the days of confusion and grief following the king's death, when the barons traveled to Castle Arlen for the funeral rites, leaving their armies leaderless, he had attacked, overrunning the southeastern quarter of the kingdom in a matter of days, routing the confused, leaderless forces that tried to oppose him. Duncan, young and inexperienced, could never have stood against him. The kingdom was his for the taking, the throne was his for the asking. Then, Lord Northolt, the king's supreme army commander, had rallied some of the younger barons into a loyal confederation, giving strength to Duncan's resolve and stiffening the wavering courage of the others. The armies had met at Hackham Heath, close by the Slipsunder River, and the battle swayed in the balance for 5 hours, with attack and counterattack and massive loss of life. The Slipsunder was a shallow river, but its treacherous reaches of quicksand and soft mud had formed an impassable barrier protecting Morgoth's right flank. But then one of those grey-cloaked meddlers, known as Rangers, had led a force of heavy cavalry across a secret ford 10 kilometers upstream. The armored horsemen appeared at the crucial moment of the battle and fell upon the rear of Morgoth's army. The Wargals, trained in the tumbled rocks of the mountains, had one weakness. They feared horses and could never stand against such a surprise cavalry attack. They broke, retreating to the narrow confines of Three-Step Pass and back to the mountains of Rain and Night. Morgoth, his rebellion defeated, went with them. And here he had been, exiled these 15 years, waiting, plotting, hating the men who had done this to him. Now he thought it was time for his revenge. Spies told him the kingdom had grown slack and complacent. His presence here was all but forgotten. The name Morgoth was a name of legend nowadays, a name mothers used to hush fractious children, threatening that if they did not behave, the Black Lord Morgoth would come for them. The time was ripe. Once again, he would lead his Wargals into an attack. But this time, he would have allies, and this time he would sow the ground with uncertainty and confusion beforehand. This time, none of those who conspired against him previously would be left alive to aid King Duncan. For the Wargals were not the only ancient terrifying creatures he had found in these somber mountains. He had 2 other allies, even more fearsome, the dreadful beasts known as the Kolkata. The time was ripe to unleash them.